Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar titled Acceptance and Belonging as Part of the Eating Disorder Recovery with Dr. Carolyn Coker-Ross. A few things to note as we begin. Participants will be muted upon entry and videos turned off. For technical assistance, we ask that you use the chat box located at the bottom of your screens. You will also receive an email approximately 1 month from today requesting feedback and impact on today's presentation. We also ask that you visit www.ncdus.org/training for other training opportunities. Today's training will be recorded and also available on demand. Slides will be shared immediately after the presentation, along with our evaluation. Any unanswered questions that occur during our question and answer segment at the end of this webinar will be sent via email to all attendants 1 week from today. I'll now go ahead and introduce today's speaker. Dr. Carolyn Coker-Ross is an African-American author, speaker, expert in treatment of eating disorders and trauma and addictions. Dr. Ross is a graduate of the University of Michigan Medical School. She completed a residency in preventative medicine and a master's in public health at Loma Linda University and a fellowship in integrative medicine at the University of Arizona. She is board certified in preventative medicine and in addiction medicine. Dr. Ross has been an international speaker and consultant on issues of mental health, trauma, workplace productivity, and intergenerational trauma. Dr. Ross presented at TEDx Pleasant Grove Talk on historical and intergenerational trauma in January 2020. She is co-founder of the Institute for Anti-Racism and Equity, a consulting group that offers DEI trainings to organizations on diversity, anti-racism, and equity in the workplace. I'll now turn things over to Dr. Carolyn Coker-Ross.
Thank you, Lachelle, and thanks for everybody who's attending. So as she mentioned, we're going to be talking about acceptance and belonging. It's not something that usually we talk about when we talk about eating disorder recovery. A lot of it is focused on food and, activity level and whether or not you should exercise and so on. So I want to shift the focus because I think there's a need, especially now when so many people are changing body size with the new medications, for us to really look at some of the underlying important aspects of eating disorder recovery. So these are the objectives. And let's start with you. So maybe you were like this little girl who didn't feel, even when she was young, that she fit in or that she belonged. She may have looked the same, or maybe she was bullied because she didn't look the same as her peers. You may have been able to pretend that you were okay, but there may have been a cognitive dissonance that made you feel as if you didn't belong or feel as if something was wrong with you because you didn't fit in. So most people who struggle with an eating disorder have a history of childhood adversity or adverse childhood experiences. And we're finally being able to acknowledge that in eating disorder treatment. But childhood trauma is really like a shadow that can follow you throughout your entire life. And sometimes it even reaches into the lives of future generations, which is what we call intergenerational trauma. And I think I've spoken on that before here, so I won't be addressing that today. But I want you to keep in mind this shadow that is creating helped you survive as a child, your coping strategies that helped you survive as a child, but as an adult may have caused problems in your life. So what is acceptance and belonging as it relates to eating disorder recovery? Well, in the context of an eating disorder, acceptance refers to acknowledging and embracing our thoughts, our beliefs, our feelings, and our experiences without judging them. And I really can't emphasize that enough because self-judgment is really like the engine that drives eating disorder behaviors. Um, it also involves recognizing and coming to terms with the reality of, yes, I have an eating disorder. That's really an integral first step. And, it's about accepting yourself, both what you consider your good qualities and also your vulnerabilities. And I think this is really difficult for people with eating disorders, body image issues, etc. Acceptance in eating disorder recovery also entails letting go of that constant pursuit for perfection, whether it be in your body or in your eating behaviors or your exercise, etc. It involves understanding that recovery is not about achieving an idealized version of yourself. It's really about accepting yourself as you are in this moment. Doesn't mean that things may not change for you later, but this self-judgment, as I said, continues to fuel eating disorder behaviors. It's also about learning to live authentically and compassionately with yourself, and we're going to be talking more about that as I go along, and embracing the ups and downs of the recovery journey, including setbacks and relapses, without self-blame and without shame. So that's really important. And how do you do that? Well, it involves self-compassion and being able to treat yourself with some gentleness and kindness. In terms of belonging in the context of eating disorder recovery, it also involves being accepted, understood, and supported within a community or a social network. And we know that healing or recovery communities in eating disorder world are super important for all of our recovery. And belonging entails a sense of connection, a sense of, camaraderie with others who share similar experiences or struggles with an eating disorder. So I'm not going to go into childhood trauma in detail in this talk, but I just want to remind you of the ways in which we have been studying childhood trauma, including the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study and the addition by the CDC of adverse community environments, which in particular have pertinence to underrepresented minorities or BIPOC individuals who may have been experiencing many of these adverse community environments more. So also wanted to just give you the opportunity, if you haven't done your own ACE quiz and gotten your own ACE score, you can use this QR code to just, take a picture of it, as you all know how to do that now. Or you can see over here the link to the ACE quiz. So the ACE quiz is about what happened to you, sorry. And that's where we're going to be starting, is understanding a little bit about that. Again, not going into great detail about trauma, but it's really important, if you're a practitioner or a mental health professional, that you start with yourself, with healing yourself, with understanding what happened to you first before you then go and work with clients. And I have gone through this journey myself, particularly around the preparation for my TEDx talk on historical and intergenerational trauma. So another form of trauma that doesn't get talked about a lot, or until recently didn't get talked about a lot, is race-based trauma or racial trauma. And that the definition is there on the slide. And again, as you might expect, BIPOC individuals are more vulnerable due to living under a system of white supremacy, so have more exposure to race-based traumatic stress. And these experiences can have really detrimental psychological impact on individuals and also on communities, and they can cause symptoms very similar to those that we see with post-traumatic stress disorder. And that can look like depression, anger, recurring thoughts of the event, nightmares, physical reactions like headaches, stomach aches, also that red alert or hypervigilance state. It can affect self-esteem and also cause kind of a mental distancing or dissociation from events. And some or all of these may be present. I think we haven't really been spending a lot of time looking at this particular form of trauma, and it's important because in all of our lives, all of BIPOC individuals' lives, it's recurring over and over on a regular basis. So it's not just one incident that happened, it's multiple incidents almost daily. So I wanted to play this short video for you, but I have to give you a little warning that there is a racial slur used and there are cuss words being used here. So if that's a problem for you, you can just mute yourself or mute this.
For me, it was at my all-white Catholic school.
Oh shit, she better tell us a story.
I have a story I'd like to tell you that I think might be helpful. 1991, Central Jersey, the Midwest of New Jersey. We're on the playground. It's in the middle of a kickball game. And I missed the ball 2 times. And the school bully, Scott, yelled at me in front of all the kids. Learn how to kick, you dumb nigger. Oh, Mavis. And I was so young and so shy and polite that I just said, thank you, Scott, and ran around to all the bases. And when I got home, I told my parents, and my mom said, where's your lunchbox? I'm not buying you another lunchbox. And my dad said, well, congratulations, Mavis. They know you're Black now.
That's definitely them.
Mavis, what would you have wanted your mom to say?
I actually, I don't know. Because it's still like really hard to know what to do now, even. So, maybe they didn't even know what to do back then. I think.
It's so hard to figure out what to say in those moments. I mean, that shit be coming out of nowhere sometimes.
Yeah. So the purpose of showing you this video really is to just highlight how something that happened when she was a young child has stayed with her throughout her adulthood. And she may not think about it, but you can see it still has an emotional impact on her. And I think it also mirrors the difficulty in knowing, what do you do? What do you say? How do you teach your children to deal with those things that we know are going to happen? So when we look at race-based traumatic stress and ask how does that affect eating disorder recovery? Well, we know that it affects access to treatment. Racism and discrimination can create barriers for BIPOC individuals to get treatment for their eating disorder. People may have limited access to health care, lack of culturally competent care, and financial constraints, which can affect their ability to access recovery. There are also cultural factors that, discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or cultural background may contribute to feelings of inadequacy or shame about one's body, making it harder to accept yourself and seek support for recovery. Racism and discrimination can also impact social support networks, making it challenging for people who are in recovery to find understanding and empathetic communities. So feeling ostracized, sometimes by our own families or by peers, due to these internalized attitudes can lead us to feel, or people with eating disorders to feel isolated, and that can affect our recovery. And then internalized racism, which is experiencing racism, and that can then lead to us internalizing feelings of inferiority, shame, stigma about having an eating disorder. Okay, so that was all about what happened to you and the impact on acceptance and belonging. And I just want to mention briefly here the way that trauma, including race-based trauma, impacts all of us. If you've had early childhood trauma, particularly if you have ACE scores above 4, that increases the risk for a lot of adult issues that are related to early childhood trauma. But I'm just going to quickly tell you a little bit about that, including number one, trauma changes the brain, puts us on red alert because it affects the stress response system. Number two, trauma affects our attachment. We cannot feel like we belong unless we can trust people. And of course, trauma affects trust. Number three, trauma can be passed from one generation to another. And finally, that trauma can hijack a person's potential in life. So 90% of our brain growth happens before we go to kindergarten. And so I'm just highlighting again that trauma has this physical impact on the body and on brain development. And depending on the timing of the trauma, we may have physical, emotional, or mental disorders such as eating disorders, depression, anxiety, and so on. So let's just look at some of these effects. And just ask yourself, how this might have impacted you. So this is about trauma affecting attachment. And here's an example of really great attachment.
Not this one. This is yes, but that's what I was wondering. I don't know because it's been season because they gonna get some stuff this time. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh yeah, yeah.
I think, well, this guy did this as a natural thing, but it's now become a viral video. But I think it's a beautiful example of attachment experiences, and we know that our early social environment directly impacts the limbic system and therefore impacts learning, memory, and our ability to cope with stress. And attachment insecurity actually mediates the relationship between childhood trauma and other psychological issues. And in general, attachment insecurity can be seen as a vulnerability to mental disorders. The other important effect on the brain is how changes in the brain can lead to trauma effects that are passed from one generation to another. So in this example, generation 1 is here, and this is a woman who smokes while pregnant, and that could turn on certain genes, whether it be gene for cancer or for other things related to smoking. And once that gene is turned on, it's turned on in the child that she's carrying. That can induce changes, or that change in genetic expression can be passed from one generation to the next. So in herself, her unborn daughter here, and her daughter's reproductive cells, and her daughter's reproductive cells. So this is something that we're learning more about every day. When I first started talking about this, back in, I don't know, 2020 or earlier, we weren't really clear about it, and there's still a lot to clear up, but there's a lot of promising research that is showing us the impact of this. So if you now understand what happened to you, in other words, what was your ACE score, how did you cope? So this is an exercise I do with my patients. I have used it in my program for eating disorders for a long time. And I call it the paintball exercise. So this little football shaped area here is what I call the paintball. And in it are all the things that happened to you. So these are things you had no control over. You know, you may have been abused as a child or neglected. You may have experienced physical pain, trauma, death of a loved one, your parents may have been divorced, you may have experienced natural disasters, you may have been bullied, and the list goes on. So that's stuff that we need to be aware of, and we need to understand how what's in our pain ball has affected us throughout the rest of our lives. But this part above here is how we coped, whether it be starting from childhood or even later, and starting early childhood later. So how you could cope, it could be, for example, staying in denial. Oh, nothing happened, or that happened so long ago, it doesn't mean anything. You may have coped through an eating disorder because food is the number one thing we have available to soothe ourselves with, right? So whether it develops into a binge eating disorder or anorexia or other eating disorder, bulimia, etc., you may have fallen into a victim role, always questioning, why is it happening to me? It's not fair. It shouldn't be happening. And then other people use anger as a way to cope, or used substance use disorders, become very judgmental, opinionated, etc. So if you want to, feel free to copy this for yourself and to do the paintball exercise, filling in what's in your paintball and then understanding how you cope by adding in these other layers. The important thing to know about the paintball exercise is that nothing much changes as long as you stay up here. So you really have to understand and begin to heal from what's in your pain ball. If you continue to stay in the coping mechanisms, nothing shifts, nothing changes. So it's hard to heal. We know the long-term effects of trauma, and if you think about the risk due to adverse childhood experiences, 44% of the risk for depression is related to adverse childhood experiences, 24% for drinking, 63% for substance use disorders, 60% for suicide, and then, of course, all of the medical problems like heart disease, lung problems, unemployment, and smoking. So how does trauma affect acceptance and belonging in eating disorder recovery? Well, in a number of ways. First of all, it affects how we see ourselves. It can distort our own perception of who we are as a person. And that can lead to feelings of shame, self-blame, feeling like you're not worthy. And this distorted self-perception then can hinder your feeling accepted, making it difficult to acknowledge and validate your experiences and emotions related to the eating disorder. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, it creates barriers to trust and connection. So just think about all the ways in which that can impact you, whether it be at work, you don't trust your coworkers, you're not able to network easily, etc. Because trauma erodes trust, not just in other people, but also trust in yourself. And this can challenge your ability to connect to others and to connect to your own feelings. If you've experienced trauma, you may fear that other people will reject you or judge you or abandon you, and this then can lead to isolating. Emotional dysregulation, we know that trauma affects our ability to manage our emotions and can lead to that red alert state, leading to intense emotions such as anxiety, depression, anger, or numbing to avoid feeling those intense emotions. And this makes it tolerable. It makes it difficult for people to tolerate distress and engage in self-compassion and non-judgmental ways of relating to themselves and to others. Avoidance coping. Trauma survivors have to cope with distressing thoughts, feelings, or memories related to their trauma. And if they avoid that, this can extend to avoiding thoughts or discussions also of their eating disorder. And then the last couple is reactivation of the trauma response. So engaging in behaviors associated with eating disorders such as restriction, binging, purging can trigger trauma responses or can be used over and over as a way to cope with trauma activation. These trauma responses can reaffirm or reinforce feelings of shame, guilt, and self-blame. And then the final one is that most people with eating disorders also have co-occurring disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, or other mood disorders, substance use disorders, and other addictions like gambling, etc. So this complex interplay between trauma and co-occurring disorders can really block the ability to experience acceptance in recovery. So I always say that wherever you go, you take your trauma with you. And if you think about that, you can look in your work, your relationships, how you were in school, your friendships, how you parent, how you manage your finances, because trauma affects every single one of those areas. So take a moment to reflect for yourself on how you show up at work. And I'm going to give you a couple of case examples in a moment, but I really encourage you to think really hard and fast about that, because we come to believe that, well, everybody does this, or this happened to everybody, or my family was no different than other people's. But if you have taken the quiz and you know your ACE score, then you know that there were things that happened to you. So let's talk specifically about body image and how many of us cope with what happened to us is through the use of food, because that's, as I said, the most easily available. That's our number one coping mechanism from babies on up. So what does this thing that a lot of people say over and over who have eating disorders, which is, I feel fat. Well, what does that really mean? The thought, I feel fat, really applies to or points to unresolved issues, either from the past or from current life stressors. But when you look at it at the deepest level possible, this thought, I feel fat, is an expression of the desire that we all have to belong and to be accepted. In the current iteration of our society, people living in larger bodies in particular are stigmatized, ridiculed, and bullied, and made to feel that they don't belong. Add to this the perpetuation of the big lie, that's what I call it, that if you are thin, everything will be perfect. You'll fit in, you'll be accepted, you'll belong, and so on. You'll be happy and you'll be healthy, which is the new iteration of why you need to lose weight. Well, we're currently living in an era where, for many people, as never before, they have the ability through the use of medication to lose weight. And that can circumvent eating disorder recovery because, again, the big lie says, well, if you're thin, you don't need to deal with your problems. If you're thin, you don't need to address past traumas. If you're thin, you don't need to work on your maladaptive coping behaviors. And I think that's the real danger in what we're seeing play out. But what I'll talk about a little bit later is that, you can't really truly belong unless you're being authentically yourself. And part of being authentic is obviously having agency over your own body. And that means your body is nobody else's business. And I have to think about that every time I go into the doctor's office where they're going to tell me that I need to lose weight. But my body is not their business. Healing from trauma and childhood adversity is a journey that enables the development of the authentic self. And this journey is not something that anybody else can tell you how to do. So I'm not coming down on any side about this controversy about the medications now. But there may be guides along the way that help you integrate parts of yourself that have been shunned, that have the image that's been perverted by society, and the dreams and desires that may have been thrown to the wayside, waiting while you were waiting to become thin. So finally, body image issues are really a red herring. They're a stand-in for what is really bothering you. So when you say, I feel fat, when my patients say that to me, I ask them, what are you really feeling? What's going on in your life? This notion of I feel fat actually help you look beneath the surface and find what has been waiting to discover. And that is who you truly are, your authentic self, and who you are meant to be. So obviously, social justice has to take into account the impact of society and social mores. But we can't change that overnight, but what we can do is change how we feel about ourselves and whether we are being authentically ourselves. So an example of how, trauma coping behaviors can show up in people who look very successful and are very successful include these two cases. The first is Marianne, the undervalued educator. Marianne is a talented and experienced educator who often feels undervalued and is overlooked for promotions. Her childhood was marked by neglect and emotional abuse, and that led her to internalize the belief that she doesn't deserve success. She's not worthy. This self-perception manifests in her professional life, where she hesitates to step up for herself and to pursue higher positions, despite the fact that she's very, very capable. The second one is Jane, the overachiever. And I know many of you, like me, may identify with this one. She's a highly driven project manager, exemplifies the effects of intergenerational trauma. Her father had unpredictable behavior and rageful outbursts during her childhood, and that led Jane to cope by overachieving, constantly seeking approval in her professional life. While this drive initially seemed beneficial, it masked deeper issues. Her relentless pursuit of perfection and approval led to burnout and difficulty in delegating tasks, affecting both her well-being and her team's efficiency. It also has impacted her relationship with romantic partners. She's been married and divorced twice. So here you have two women, two BIPOC women, who look very successful, are very successful, but have unhealed childhood trauma or neglect or abuse, and it can show up and harm them as adults. So this is another exercise that I've used often with patients of mine with eating disorders, and I call it ED me versus non-ED me. I know it's not the greatest name, but it's asking and helping you answer the question, who have you become in your eating disorder? And how does that contrast with your authentic self? So this is actually an exercise you can do where on the left-hand side, you write, what are you like when you're active in your eating disorder? What kind of clothes do you wear? Who do you hang out with? How do you show up at work? Just like I said, where do you take your trauma? How are you in relationships when you're in your eating disorder self? You can envision kind of almost seeing a movie of yourself. And in part of the movie, you're showing up as your eating disorder self. And just ask yourself, what characteristics is the actor who's playing you and who's active in your eating disorder show? And then the second part is characteristics of your authentic self. Some people call it your soul self. Characteristics of your soul self or authentic self are those things that never change about you. So they're your most the characteristics that maybe people who knew you as a child, if someone says, what's so-and-so like, or what was she like as a child? You would say, you know, curious, intelligent, happy-go-lucky, fun-loving, quirky, whatever those characteristics are, those don't change. However, they may become buried in the eating disorder self. But if you think of it, for example, just small things. One of my patients said, when I was a little girl, I used to like to wear clunky jewelry. And she actually had pictures of herself wearing this clunky jewelry, but that was her. She was quirky and unusual in that way. But beneath the eating disorder self is the authentic self who's yearning for self-expression. And again, that is the essence of who you are, the part of you that never changes. And why do you need to look at these two separately? Well, it gives you some distance between the negative judgments and emotions that can keep you really stuck. Okay, so let's connect the dots. Here are six babies. Given that 60% or 2/3 of all Americans have at least one adverse childhood experience, and 1 in 5 have greater than 4 or have severe childhood adversity in their past. So if you pick the middle 4 children and imagine one of these babies is you or your mother, your father, your grandparents, because again, the trauma effects can be spread from generation to generation. We start as babies with the most crucial needs for attachment and belonging. And if we don't get that, that can again set us up for problems in adulthood. Studies have shown that children who have not achieved healthy attachment in their young life have lower self-esteem, a more negative worldview, and are mistrustful and always afraid of being rejected. Depression, anxiety, and suicide are common mental health conditions associated with this lack of belonging. And these can lead to social behaviors that interfere with your ability to connect to others. So why is belonging important in eating disorder recovery? I think belonging obviously provides us with social support when we belong to a community of like-minded people in recovery. It can provide validation and understanding, make us feel less alone. It can reduce stigma and shame that's often associated with eating disorder diagnoses. And belonging to a support group can also provide accountability, kind of help keep us on track, and the motivation to stay committed to our recovery. It also can offer a sense of identity and purpose, sense of who we are outside of our illness, the non-ED me. And it can foster personal growth and fulfillment. It also offers learning and growth, skill building, sharing experiences. All of those can be part of belonging to a supportive community, and it may help prevent relapse. So acceptance is important also for reducing stigma and shame. I'm just going to highlight a couple that I didn't discuss with belonging. One is promoting self-compassion. Acceptance really does foster self-compassion, which is essential to navigating the challenges of recovery. When you're able to accept yourself just as you are without focusing on being perfect or having the perfect body or the perfect eating or whatever, then you're more able to treat yourself with kindness and understanding. Another is facilitating those healing relationships. Feeling accepted and supported by others reduces the sense of isolation that having an eating disorder can cause. And then, of course, challenging perfectionism. Eating disorders are often thought to be disorders of control. I think of them as disorders of trauma, but trauma does, also lead to that sense of wanting to control your life. And then empowering authenticity, it encourages you to embrace your authentic self. If you feel comfortable, like you're accepted and you belong, you can feel free to be authentic. I recently had an experience of this when I was speaking at another conference, and it's a pretty large conference, and often I can feel, anxious about my performance or how I'm going to be viewed or whatever. But this time I was speaking with a close friend of mine who I felt completely accepted and by her. I trusted her implicitly. It never entered my mind that she would ever do anything to harm me or sabotage me, which isn't, 100% the case in the real world. But to make a long story short, it was probably the best presentation I've ever done. And I look back at that because I got great reviews. One person said, "This is the best presentation I've seen in 20 years." I'm like, "Wow, what did I do differently?" And the thing that I did differently was accept myself and tap into that support from my friend and just allow myself to be truly and authentically who I am. So this is the kind of path to recovery at the deepest level that I've used for over 20 years in my practice and in my work with people with eating disorders and addictions. So these 5 steps to recovery start with the most superficial level of recovery, which is, the level of behaviors. That's what everybody sees. That's the tip of the iceberg that's above the water. But it's not what's below the water. And often with an iceberg, there's a bigger part of the ice is below the water. But we have to start with these superficial behaviors. And then we look at the emotional soup, which are all the emotions that people have trouble expressing or are in the emotional soup, so they're in their emotions all the time. And these emotions are what drive the behaviors. So when you think about, eating disorder behaviors that you or your patients have or clients have, you have to really look at what are the emotions that are driving those behaviors. And then the third level is the sensate level, the level of body sensations related to the emotions. And these can be butterflies in the stomach, tightness in the chest, tight shoulders, clenched jaw, etc. When you connect to your body, when you become more embodied, that's when you can heal at a deeper level, because the body is the place where, first of all, trauma is kept and held. And the body is also the first place where your emotions show up by those body sensations. And if you can identify the body sensation, for example, associated with your angry outbursts, then you can interrupt them at an earlier stage. And number 4 are core beliefs. These are beliefs that are formed usually when we're younger, when we go through traumatic times, or when there's a period in your life of intense distress or, difficulty. And often we forget about them, but they are kind of the operating system that drives everything. So beliefs like, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, no one will love me unless I'm fill in the blank. Those are things that form as a result of trauma. They're beliefs that form as a result of trauma. And then they are in the background, just operating the system for us. And then finally, if we really go to the deepest level of recovery, it's the deeper urges of our spirit, our soul. It's about our authentic self. When you can live from that place in that 5th step, more often than not, then the whole thing flips, and your authentic self then determines what beliefs are. Your authentic self is embodied. Your authentic self can learn to regulate emotions and also can govern your behaviors. So Brene Brown says, belonging is the innate human desire to be part of something larger than us. Because this yearning is so primal, we often try to acquire it by changing ourselves to fit in and by seeking approval, which are not only hollow substitutes for belonging, but often barriers to it. Because true belonging only happens when we present our authentic and perfect selves to the world. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. Do you want to read that one again? I think that's really, really important. Only by becoming aware of how our eating disorder is currently holding us hostage can we hope to break free. Becoming more aware is like shining a flashlight into a dark cave. The more aware you are, the brighter the light becomes and the less scary the cave feels. So how do we make these changes? How do we tap into our authenticity and bring belonging and acceptance? Well, resilience is the way. And if you weren't lucky enough to be born with a great deal of resilience, don't worry, you can also learn resilience. And this little slide just talks about how even if you yourself didn't experience trauma, but you're experiencing intergenerational effects of trauma, it's important to recognize that resilience can help you with that too. As you focus on clearing your generational trauma, do not forget to claim your generational strengths. Your ancestors gave you more than just wounds. And we know that's true because there's so many people who may have really high ACE scores and have been abused, neglected, etc., who still do quite well in life. And you can build resistance throughout your life. And it also trauma-informed therapy can help you learn resistance through, things like trauma-informed yoga, mindfulness training, etc. So resilience is the ability to adapt to difficult situations. When stress, adversity, or trauma strikes, you still can experience emotions like grief or pain or anger, but you can keep functioning, both physically and psychologically. It's not about putting the difficult stuff in, behind you or pretending like you're over it or being stoic or figuring it out on your own. In fact, being able to reach for support is a key aspect of building resilience. So on this slide, again, you have a QR code, which this time leads you to the resilience quiz, and you can download that and take that at your leisure. And on the left, I have listed some of the key factors that can help you build resilience. The first is having a parental network, or if your parents were the perpetrators in your trauma, you can have spiritual parents who help you, and maybe an aunt, a grandparent, etc., extended network. Feeling safe, if you're able to find places and people where you feel safe, able to, if you're lucky enough to have high self-esteem, that can help. Self-efficacy is really just a practice where the more you challenge yourself to, whether it be express emotions or manage emotions, for example, the stronger you build self-efficacy. Whereas if you continue to use the maladaptive coping mechanisms that have helped you in the past as a child, perhaps, but are harming you now, then you're building that muscle. So you have to choose. Finding a sense of meaning in life, whether that's spiritual or cultural beliefs, connecting with others, having goals, dreams, talent, skill, and coping skills. So I'll ask you just for a moment now to, if you're comfortable, close your eyes. If you're not comfortable doing that, just pick a point in front of you. See if you can put your feet flat on the floor. I just wanted to do a short guided process with you. So I encourage you to take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. With the next deep breath, allow your breath to move to the top of your head, down your face, back of your neck, and your shoulders, releasing tension or tightness as you go along. Now with the next breath, move into your chest, down your back, into your belly, and your hips. And when you exhale, exhale tightness, tension, discomfort, dis-ease. Now breathing into your thighs, the backs of your legs, your knees, your calves, and your feet. And moving your breath all the way to the center of the earth. And releasing in your out breath any tightness or tension. Now think of a time when you were truly yourself, when you felt safe with who you were. The last time you felt truly authentic. And just feel the feeling that authenticity brought to you, whether it's joy or excitement, whatever it is, just soak yourself in that feeling. If you don't remember a time, you can also think of people that you know, whether it be a favorite celebrity or someone in your own family who you feel is very authentic, and just notice what they do and how they might feel. Just breathe in the feeling of being authentically, fully yourself. Now ask yourself, if I were to be my authentic self, I would, and fill in the blank. If I were to be my authentic self, I would, what would you do different? How would you feel? How would you act? If I were to be my authentic self, I would. Just imagine yourself doing whatever that is. Breathe that in. Solidify that feeling by taking your breath and breathing it into every cell in your body, moving all the way through your body to the tips of your toes and anchoring it into the center of the earth. This is not a to-do list. This is an intuitive guide. Take another moment. Breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth, and then slowly bring yourself back to the room where you're sitting and open your eyes when you're ready. Okay, thank you. I hope that was helpful, and I'm happy to take questions if anybody has any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ross, for that. And thank you all. As a reminder, we will be sending a copy of this presentation at the end of the webinar, along with the evaluation. If you have any questions, we ask that you place them in the question and answer box so that we can get Dr. Ross to address any questions that folks may have at this time. If anyone has any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. We don't seem to have any questions at this time, Dr. Ross.
Okay,
I
thank
don't,
you.
you are absolutely welcome. Feel free to send us an email with any additional questions or somebody sending comments. We have someone saying that this was very beneficial. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Yes. So we truly appreciate everyone for coming out today. Thank you so much for attending. And once again, as a reminder, we will send a copy of these slides out with the evaluation at the end of this webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Ross. If you have any final statement or words, feel free to share. We have lots of comments coming in saying this was great and thank you so much.
Yeah, I think the only comment I would share is just to reinforce how self-compassion and self-care help all of what we're dealing with come to fruition. So I just encourage people to find new ways, better ways to take care of themselves and each other.
Thank you so much for that. Oh, we'll go ahead and end this presentation. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody, for attending.